New York City, February 26, 1917. Five musicians walk into a recording studio. They are nervous. They have never made a record before. The engineer moves them around the room, testing positions, adjusting distances from the horn. The bass drum is too loud. The trombone needs to move back. The clarinet needs to move forward. They record 2 songs. 30 minutes later, it is done. That recording sold 1 million copies, launched jazz around the world, and built the foundation of the modern music industry. But it did not record who invented jazz. It recorded who was allowed into the studio. And those are 2 completely different stories. To understand what happened on February 26, 1917, you need to understand what New Orleans sounded like in 1900. In the streets and dance halls and churches of a city unlike anywhere else in America. A city that mixed French and Spanish and African and Caribbean influences in ways the rest of the country had never seen. Something new was happening to music. The blues was there. Ragtime was there. The syncopated rhythms of African music, filtered through decades of American experience, were there. And somewhere in that collision, musicians were discovering that if you played with enough freedom, if you bent the notes, if you improvised over the structure, if you let the feeling lead rather than the written page, the music became something that nobody had heard before. It wasn't called jazz yet, nobody had named it, but everyone in New Orleans knew who was playing it best. His name was Charles Joseph Bolden. They called him Buddy. Buddy Bolden was a cornetist, a trumpet player essentially, who led the most popular band in New Orleans at the turn of the century. He played with a volume and a freedom that was physically startling. People said you could hear him from miles away. He mixed the blues with ragtime, with church music, with whatever he felt in the moment, and what came out was something that made people move in ways they hadn't moved before. In 1900, Buddy Bolden was the most famous musician in New Orleans. He never recorded a single note. In 1906, something happened to Buddy Bolden. He had been drinking heavily for years. He had been suffering from what his contemporaries described as erratic behavior, paranoia, violent outbursts, and inability to hold himself together. In August 1906, while marching in a Labor Day parade, he suffered a complete mental breakdown in the middle of the street. In 1907, at the age of 30, Buddy Bolden was committed to the Louisiana State Insane Asylum in Jackson. He would never play again. He would never record. He spent the next 24 years in that institution, while the music he had created spread across America without him. While the musicians who had learned from him took his sound to Chicago, to New York, to the stages and clubs and recording studios of a country discovering jazz for the first time. Buddy Bolden died in 1931. He had been in the asylum for 24 years. He left behind one single photograph, a blurry image of a band taken sometime around 1905. A man holding a cornet, the only visual record of the man most historians credit with inventing jazz. No recordings, no royalties, no name on any record label, just a photograph, and the music that filled the world without him. Meanwhile, in New York, the music business was paying attention. In January 1917, a 5-piece band from New Orleans arrived in Manhattan and began playing at Reisenweber's Cafe, a fashionable restaurant near Columbus Circle. The band was called the original Dixieland Jass Band, with 2 S's, not a C, following the local New Orleans spelling of the word. The band was white. This was not incidental. The dance halls and restaurants and recording studios of New York in 1917 did not book black musicians. The Victor Talking Machine Company, the most powerful record label in America, did not record black artists. The industry that would define who owned the sound of the 20th century was built on a color line as rigid as any in American life. The original Dixieland Jass Band was not the best jazz band in New Orleans. They were not the inventors of the music they were playing. Their leader, Nick LaRocca, had grown up listening to the black musicians of New Orleans, had absorbed the rhythms and the freedom and the feeling that those musicians had developed over decades, and he had brought it to New York. Because he could. 6 weeks after their opening night at Reisenweber's, the Victor Talking Machine Company invited the ODJB to record. On February 26, 1917, they recorded Livery Stable Blues and Dixieland Jass Band One Step. 30 minutes. 2 songs. The engineer adjusted the horn. The musicians found their positions. The red signal light came on. They counted 2 beats and began to play. The record sold 1 million copies. Jazz was now on record, and whoever was on record owned the narrative. Nick LaRocca spent the rest of his life insisting that jazz was his invention. In 1936, he wrote to Tempo magazine, "Our music is strictly white man's music." He claimed that black musicians had simply copied what his band had created, inverting the entire history of the music he had absorbed from watching Buddy Bolden's peers play in the streets of New Orleans. The music industry, built on that first million-selling record, repeated versions of that story for decades. The consequences were not abstract. While LaRocca collected royalties and recognition, the black musicians who had actually developed the jazz vocabulary, who had spent decades creating the rhythmic freedom and the improvisational language that the ODJB brought to Victor's studios, received nothing. No recordings, no royalties, no authorship. The music they created was absorbed, recorded, sold, and credited to someone else. This was not an accident. It was the operating principle of the music industry at the moment of its birth. The first jazz record did not capture the invention of jazz. It captured the moment the music industry decided who would own it. There is a question underneath this story that the music industry has never fully answered. What does it mean to own a sound? The Victor Talking Machine Company could answer that question in legal terms. A recording is owned by whoever paid for the session. A song is owned by whoever registered the copyright. The industry that grew from that first million-selling record built its entire architecture on those principles. But those principles, applied in 1917 to a recording made by white musicians playing music invented by black musicians in a city where black musicians could not get into the studio, produced something that looks, 100 years later, less like a system of ownership and more like a system of erasure. Buddy Bolden never made a recording. The music he created, the sound he developed from the blues and the ragtime and the church music of New Orleans, the improvised language that would eventually become the most influential American art form of the 20th century, was recorded and sold and celebrated without him. He died in an asylum in 1931, having never heard himself on record. And the man who claimed to have invented the music he created sold 1 million copies of it before Bolden had been locked away for a decade. The first jazz record is a masterpiece and a theft, and the difference between those two things is still being argued about today.